All right, welcome to the third set of lectures in Ethics in the World of Business. The topic this week is self-interest and the problems that come up when people act only in their own self-interest. The first discussion is going to be on ethical and psychological egoism. You need to know the difference between these two. First, just to review, our way of classifying ethical theories. Remember, we looked at what we thought was a typical an ethically problematic situation, and it usually involved some person, some agent, making a decision, and the decision will have certain results. All right, so we have the agent makes a decision and produces an outcome. Now, we have to assess these different parts of the decision. So if you look at the nature of the agent, what sort of person that agent is, you're looking at identity-based ethical theories like virtue ethics, care ethics. If you look at the motivations behind the decision, then you are looking at a principle-based system. You're looking at what principles motivate people. And if you look at the outcomes or the consequences, then you're making a consequence-based type of ethical theory. So this conceptual map shows this: ethical theories, identity-based, motivation-based, and result-based. And three types of result-based ones: subjective consequentialism, utilitarianism, and ethical egoism. So this is what we're going to look at today. Ethical egoism is a type of consequence-based ethical theory. And we're going to look at also a way of getting around some of the dilemmas of cooperation, which is called contractarianism. Now, first you have to understand the difference between psychological and ethical egoism. Psychological egoism is an empirical theory. Okay, that's very important. It's a scientific theory and it says that people always act to maximize their own self-interest. This is sort of the empirical theory behind modern economics. We assume that the people in the market are acting in their own self-interest, and then we show what will happen with supply and demand curves and so on. So psychological egoism is roughly the scientific theory behind scientific economics, the science of economics. Ethical egoism is an ethical theory, and it says that people ought to act to maximize their own self-interest. That's your job. You ought to act to maximize your own narrow self-interest. Okay? Empirical theory says that this is the way people do, the way people act. Ethical egoism says this is the way people ought to act. Notice that there is an is-ought gap between these two theories. Finally, notice too that ethical egoism is not the same as ethical relativism. Ethical relativism is the view that what your what's true or what's right or wrong for you is relative to your culture. Ethical egoism is this view that you always ought to act to maximize your own narrow self-interest. The two can connect, but they are very different theories. Ethical relativism is a meta-ethical theory. It's about the nature of ethics. Ethical egoism is a normative ethical theory. It tells you what to do. Here's a simple argument for ethical egoism. Start with the consequentialist premise that each agent ought to cause the maximum aggregate value for anybody who has moral standing. You add to that the ethical egoist view of moral standing, which is that only the self has moral standing. You only have to worry about your own interests. And then you get an argument that each agent ought to cause the maximum value for him or herself, which is ethical egoism. There's a couple of attractions for ethical egoism. One, it seems to it helps explain why people can be motivated to do what they ought to do, because if they ought to act only in their own self-interest, and they are, by psychological egoism, motivated to do that, that's what people do, then you get this explanation of why people are motivated to do what they ought. You could also add, perhaps, that if psychological egoism is such that you can only act in your self-interest, then that means that ethical egoism would be the only possible theory. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There's also another argument from a famous saying by Adam Smith about the market and the invisible hand of the market. Adam Smith wrote that the market, by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many cases, led by an invisible hand, you must recall that from studying economics, to promote an end that was no part of his intention, because the person was self-interested. They wanted to produce what was best for them, but they're led by an invisible hand to promote the interests of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Okay, so this is an argument that if people are egoists within a market society, then we will promote the good of the society. Okay, and that's another attraction that people have for ethical egoism. Okay, so let's see if you've got this. First of all, classify this claim. People always seek their own welfare. Pause the video, commit yourself to one of these answers, and we'll discuss it in just a second. Okay, welcome back. I hope you've committed yourself to one of these answers. People always seek their own welfare. Is that ethical relativism? Well, does it have anything to say about what culture the person is from? No, it's not saying that only in certain cultures do people seek their own welfare. Is it ethical pluralism, which you recall is the view that you have to consult various different ethical theories? No, there's nothing ethical in that whole statement. It just says people do always seek. This is the case that people always seek their own welfare. So there's nothing ethical in it, so it can't be ethical pluralism, and it also can't be ethical egoism, right? Because it's making a factual claim, an empirical claim that people always seek their own welfare, which may or may not be true. So it's not ethical egoism, it is in fact psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is the doctrine that this is the way the world is. Not the way the world ought to be, but the way the world is. Here's another one for you. The culture of a market society encourages seeking one's own welfare. So it is always right to do so for presumably people who are members of a market society. Okay, pause the video, think about that one for a second, and see where you best classify that. Okay, welcome back. This is best classified, I would say, as ethical relativism, right? Culture does this, so, and assuming, deducing from that it's always right to do so. The culture of a market society encourages its members always to seek their own welfare, so it's always right for members of the market culture to seek their own welfare. So the answer here would be ethical relativism. And you can see the distinction between ethical egoism, psychological egoism, and ethical relativism. And mull on that, and I'll see you in a moment.